Remember, leave blood at the Red Cross, not on the highway.
I received the call at 5:59 p.m. It occurred on US 466 at the intersection of 41, Friday, September the 30th, 1955.
On September 30th, 1955, one of the most effective and enduring guerrilla marketing campaigns in modern history kicked off at the junction of U.S. Highway 466 and State Route 41, just east of Shalom, California.
A lot of Deaners have told me that they don't feel complete until they make the trip to Shalom, California.
And for his career-defining performance, James Dean would do his own stunt work.
It was a sideswipe head-on collision.
It was just like crushing a piece of tinfoil against something hard.
The young up-and-comer had made his film debut that April, and principal photography had wrapped up for his next two starring vehicles. When news first started coming out that James Dean had died in an auto wreck in the middle of nowhere, the Warner Bros. Publicity machine went into overdrive as they began converting their deceased contract player into a Hollywood god. Luckily for them, the press had taken just enough, but not too much, notice of him yet. After all, his first film had only come out 6 months before, and the hype surrounding his follow-ups had been standard fare for Warner Bros. Up till now, and the timing couldn't have been better. James Dean's 24 years on Earth covered enough ground, at each turn seeming to draw a camera to capture the moment, that the package he left behind had something for nearly every teenager to latch onto. He was strikingly photogenic, an Indiana farm boy, an all-American athlete, a rising movie star, an artist, a hipster, a beatnik, a goth, a biker, a race car driver, an orphan, a rebel, and a tortured soul. He was simultaneously magnetic and an outcast. In his immortal form, being misunderstood was James Dean's greatest strength, and for many, itself his key appeal. In the 26 days from his untimely demise to the premiere of his consummate performance in Rebel Without a Cause, Jack Warner had successfully reanimated James Dean. However, Warner Bros. Only had one more feature left in the can. Best as he could, Jack Warner tried to get the jump on their white-hot IP, but wrapping his new toy around a telephone pole instantly made James Dean a free agent. Alongside the wave of Deansploitation that came out of the gold rush to capitalize on the moment, the hunt was on for the next James Dean, who would follow in the footsteps of the Rebel Without a Cause, who would pick up the torch. The audience appetite was palpable, and the financial incentive was undeniable. For the prototypical fresh-faced, no-name dude around town hoping to snag a break in showbiz, stepping into the shoes of the immortal one was the ultimate Hollywood dream. For one, it would be his siren song. In this video, we're going to look at how dying to be famous paid off for James Byron Dean, thanks to his gambit coinciding with the rapidly shifting cultural zeitgeist of the moment, dovetailing with Formula One precision into the advent of the teenager in tandem with the pop music fad that triggered widespread moral panic. We'll look at the early wild days of Deansploitation, and we'll unpack the bizarre, never-before-told story of one would-be who heeded all caution on Halloween night 1958 as he took his pursuit to become the next James Dean all the way.
Love whispered softly by you, dragging his heart behind you, but you slipped away into the darkness.
Catch me outside, how about that?
See, this is all mouth. This is mouth.
Wild as it may be to consider today, but teenagers as we know them have only existed as a concept for a little over a century.
The question, how old must a child be before he is accountable to society, has always posed a problem. The ancient Hebrews looked upon puberty as the turning point. If a youth's voice was changing and he needed a shave, he could be charged with a crime. For the Muslims, puberty and responsibility came at 16. The Emperor Justinian placed the line at 14 for boys and 12 for girls, while young children, according to Roman law, were in the same category as lunatics. In the American colonies, children who were disrespectful to their parents could be placed in the stocks, publicly whipped, and even put to death. As late as 1819, Illinois passed a law which decreed that any child or servant who disobeyed his parent or master should be jailed until he humbled himself. A youngster found hungry, begging, or homeless could be jailed. Such children were not placed in orphanages because people believed a neglected child was sure to exhibit criminal tendencies and would therefore contaminate the helpless orphans. So any child or infant unlucky enough to be neglected was immediately jailed in a regular penal institution, along with those youngsters who had broken the law, and the adult murderers, prostitutes, beggars, feeble-minded, and lunatics.
G. Stanley Hall coined the term adolescence in 1904 in the title of his 2-volume compendium of research on the phenomenon.
The word adolescent comes from the Latin adolescere, to grow to maturity.
Prior to this, humanity throughout recorded history had recognized the perpetual enigma of how best to prepare youth for the challenges and opportunities of a world that is constantly changing.
Even today, in the more primitive cultures of the world, as in this Tuareg tribe of North Africa, customs developed through centuries of experience prepare the child for manhood. When the boy reaches puberty, at the age of 14, his father confers upon him first a veil and then a sword, symbols of nobility and maturity. There is a new master in the desert, ready to take his place in the Ahal, the center of Tuareg social life. He pays tribute to the lady of his choice, seeking her favors with songs and verses.
But adolescence was the first work to identify it as a unique stage of life. What we've come to learn since is that the prefrontal cortex, the area tasked with reason and rational judgment, is the last part of the brain to fully develop, typically around age 25. As hormonal fluctuations occur with the onset of reproductive capabilities, mood swings that range from melancholic to excitable to combative are often seen. As the adolescent struggles to reconcile the naivete and promise of childhood with the harsh realities of the adult world, an often unfounded overconfidence in their own judgment leads to rejection of social norms and a propensity for high-risk behavior in an especially reckless manner. In questioning what has been imposed on them by their elders, the search for the self often drives teenagers towards music, entertainment, and culture that they can regard as their own. In 1924, Roger Wolf Kahn became America's first teen idol of sorts when, at 16, he formed a dance band that took off quickly in popularity. By 1926, he branched out into composing and running his own booking agency for other acts, earning the nickname the Millionaire Maestro. As aging flappers swooned over Rudy Valley, Roger Wolf Kahn carved a niche among otherwise overlooked younger audiences. The man responsible for the first bona fide teen idol craze on American soil was a doctor on a house call in Hoboken, New Jersey on December 12, 1915, when a first-time mom began having severe complications in the process of giving birth. Already 30 hours in labor by the time he arrived, a C-section was out of the question. The doctor proceeded to crudely extract the baby boy, who was initially presumed to have been stillborn, but survived thanks to swift intervention by his grandmother. But the forceps used in the process had gouged his left eardrum, rendering Francis Albert Sinatra ineligible for military service later in life. As the United States' involvement in World War II began to ramp up, A-list actors like David Niven, Henry Fonda, Jimmy Stewart, and Clark Gable put their careers on hold to sign up to fight on the front lines. The draft also targeted every other able-bodied U.S. male aged 21 to 45, most of whom lacked the resources to secure a deferment. But thanks to his 4F status, Frank Sinatra was able to capitalize on the dried-up dating pool across the country.
The lonely nights, dreaming of a song.
He began singing with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra in 1940 and helped produce several gold records for the group by 1942, when he cut his first single as a solo artist, Night and Day. At his first run at the Paramount Theater in New York in December 1942, Frankie's press team hired a dozen or so girls to act over the top when he would linger on an ooh or an ah. The stunt turned out to be wholly unnecessary, as a crowd of around 5,000, mostly 13 to 19-year-old girls, went genuinely berserk at the sight of Frankie's piercing blue eyes in living color, as his sultry voice and distinct phrasing seduced them en masse. At the time, girls commonly wore ankle-length socks to dances and concerts. This casual footwear trend quickly became sexualized as a sort of underage offshoot of shoe fetishism when the media took notice of it among the fans, and Bobby Soxers took on a life of their own in popular culture.
I feel absolutely sklonklish.
Sklonklish. When I went to school, they taught us to speak English. She was feeling a little sklonklish this morning, but I got her up.
Did you sleep well?
Oh, sklonklish.
If I had a million sisters, I'd want them all to be exactly like you.
You're just saying that because I'm sklonklish.
A return engagement in 1943 drew a bigger and more fevered audience, and by Columbus Day 1944, the overflow from the turnout of around 30,000 had spilled out into Times Square, where the mildly disorderly excitement of the impatient fangirls was dubbed a riot by the press. The month prior, the first issue of 17 magazine had sold over 500,000 copies, and its mission statement offered a rare message of empowerment to its adolescent female readership.
You dictate the music charts. You are the bosses of the business.
The sudden emergence of this demographic, along with the threat of their perceived autonomy, instilled a collective anxiety amongst adults. A March 1944 article in Newsweek declared,
"The gravest tragedy of war was the moral breakdown among American girls."
I just knew it. No one in this family wants me to have any fun at all. I wish I were dead.
The corruption of the young was already a mainstay of roadshow exploitation films such as The Road to Ruin, Cocaine Fiends, Reefer Madness, and Assassin of Youth.
It was like this. You see, Skinny tripped and twisted his ankle, and we had to carry him to the hospital. Well, I don't mean we carried him, we took him there. In a car. Well, it wasn't exactly a car, it was more like a wagon.
Are you sure you're telling the truth, Bill?
Of course I'm telling the truth. The trouble with this family is nobody ever believes me.
Wartime anxieties around children in adult bodies indulging in wanton hedonism and criminality began to turn inward as Poverty Row melodramas started pointing the finger to negligent parenting.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say this, Your Honor, but I accuse my parents.
Monogram Pictures followed up 1943's Where Are Your Children with Are These Our Parents in 1944, which, along with PRC's I Accuse My Parents and RKO's Youth Run Wild that same year, framed wayward teens as
tragic victims of war and turmoil,
and the true culprits as
pleasure-mad parents.
Here is the picture that daringly exposes the truth about what's happening these war days to the teenage youngsters at home, to the boys who find the wrong outlet for their energies.
Questions like these are kind of tough to answer in any family. Suppose we hear what you have to say about them, okay?
As the boys returned home from the war, Frankie's popularity began to wane, and within a couple years, a string of film flops, public violence, an insatiable appetite for extramarital indiscretion, and a receding hairline signaled that his time as heartthrob to high schoolers was up. More on that in another video. But the teen market was firmly established, and the fashion and cosmetic industries led a heavy push to commodify adolescence.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
What I would really like to hear him say is that he appreciated that I, helped people, that I did the best that I could to try to improve life of some people, and that's what I'd like to hear him say.
The roots of the Actors Studio in New York can be traced back to the 1922-23 U.S. tour of the Moscow Art Theater, where a handful who attended went on to become fervent acolytes of Konstantin Stanislavski.
Now what you do, you take from your own life some emotional event and you relive that and then shift it across to the text, to the character.
Actors say that if you can get through Stella Adler's training, nothing will ever frighten you again. After almost 50 years of working with actors, her legend continues to grow, depending on whom you talk to.
The only thing it is that you act with your soul. You do not act words, and you do not act this. You act with your soul, and you don't have that soul yet.
Stella Adler was somewhat of a mainstay around Broadway, but never quite secured steady enough work to quit her day job as an acting teacher. She took her shot at Hollywood stardom in 1937, got nowhere, and returned to New York, where she had better luck peddling herself as a coach. Meanwhile, Lee Strasberg was a young, aimless high school dropout who became an instant convert when the Moscow Art Theater rolled through town. He picked up a couple small roles on Broadway, but by 1931 had established a reputation as the guru of an intense and vulnerable approach to acting that took on a chic appeal among the highbrows of the New York theater scene. Strasberg's first attempt to proliferate his teachings was the group theater, an actors' collective he would mold in his image. In 1947, Lee Strasberg decided it was time to monetize and put his courses behind a paywall. The Actors Studio offered dues-paying members exclusive access to workshops from world-renowned exemplars of the adage, "Those who can't do, teach." Strasberg continued to develop an Americanized version of the Stanislavski style he referred to as the method. Stella Adler also taught at the studio, and the two clashed over a dispute on their interpretations of Stanislavski's approach. Strasberg won, and the method became en vogue around the Great White Way.
The element of character was left out. I got it only at one moment, actually, when you sort of smiled to yourself. There was a kind of a, not exactly fiendish, but nonetheless a kind of a strange glee at what you had done. And that had an element of strangeness, of weirdness, of duality, which is more or less the kind of thing that you are now looking for in the character.
Ironically enough, it was Adler's protege that would propel it to the masses.
No actor in history has ever made such impact in a single role as Marlon Brando.
Marlon Brando established himself as the poster child for the method, with his raw, pained portrayal of Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, first in 1947 for the original Broadway run, then in 1951 for the film version. The notion of masochistically suffering for their art gave method actors an air of romanticism, and both Brando and the method became the epitome of Hollywood's cutting edge. Brando capitalized on a trend of returning World War II soldiers who'd struggled to adjust back to civilian life and had begun to find belonging and camaraderie in motorcycle clubs. At a rally sanctioned by the American Motorcycle Association in Hollister, California, over the 4th of July weekend, 1947, several unaffiliated clubs showed up to participate, and their drunken behavior devolved into chaos and property destruction. The Hollister riots received heavy press coverage, and after an AMA spokesperson remarked that motorcycle clubs not endorsed by the AMA were outlaws, the veterans who'd already experienced a sense of disenfranchisement from the country they'd served began to adopt an antisocial posture. 1953's The Wild One was a dramatization of the Hollister riots that continued Brando's streak, playing the kind of anti-hero characters that were seen as the optimal showcase for the method. The vilification of motorcycle gangs in the media, inspired by The Wild One, was conflated with a simmering fear of the adolescent class. The post-war prosperity of the late 40s, along with the advent of suburban life, resulted in high schoolers with disposable income of their own for the first time. And while big business was quick to identify that teens are inclined to prioritize immediate gratification over fiscal responsibility, this newfound autonomy nonetheless continued to instill fear in grown-ups. The terrors of property vandalism and loud motor vehicles disturbing the peace now added to the fear that an entire generation of the nation's youth was falling prey to corrupting forces. But the latest trend in popular music would only serve to pour jet fuel onto this fire.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock.
Rock Around the Clock had originally been written as an orchestral novelty tune in the vein of Leroy Anderson's The Syncopated Clock.
Well, 6 times 6 is 36.
Bill Haley and his Comets were a white dance combo who'd seen some success playing in the jump blues style that had been popular among black artists over the last decade.
Has this boogie-woogie been going on for some time? Man alive. And are there any other forms of this new folk music besides that?
Sure, there's swing, jive, jump.
They recorded a jump-up version of Rock Around the Clock in May 1954 that was used the following year as the theme song for MGM's paean to juvenile delinquency, Blackboard Jungle.
They didn't pull their punches, did they?
The single shot to #1 when it was re-released in May 1955, and when black R&B artists Chuck Berry and Little Richard followed Rock Around the Clock up with crossover hits Maybelline and Tutti Frutti that summer, rock and roll was born. And just as quickly, this bubbling anxiety around youth and jeopardy gelled into a full-blown moral panic. As much as parents feared the corruption of their children, teenagers themselves were now coming to be viewed as the enemy from within. Reactionaries convinced themselves rock and roll was a communist plot to weaken the moral fiber of the nation through its sexual suggestiveness and implications of race mixing.
We've set up a 20-man committee to do away with this vulgar, animalistic, nigger rock and roll bop.
It is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
The obscenity and vulgarity of the rock and roll music.
All too often recently, you've seen the black headlines in your newspapers.
Juvenile delinquency in high schools.
Wolfpack strikes again.
It is obviously a means by which the white man and his children can be driven to the level with the nigger.
Why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it.
Teenage hoodlums wreck schools.
I know what it does to you.
3 youths beat aged man to death.
And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it.
It is obviously nigger music.
I know the lost position that you get into in the beat.
In virtually all of our big cities, and in some not so large.
The first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
That 2-beat pattern is the music brought to the United States of America by the communist conspiracy to corrupt teenagers, and it's in every rock and roll number.
Hey, Steve, we must be out of our cotton-picking minds. We should be getting some sleep instead of coming here.
Maybe so. But something's getting these people out of their houses. I'm going to find out what it is. Well, now, what do you think? Oh, it's crazy music, man. That sends me, Jack.
That music sends me, man. It sends me. You guys dig that music. Go all the way.
Rock and roll is cool, Daddy, and you know it.
At their own peril, they failed to make the basic connection that teenagers inherently find things that ruffle their parents empowering.
Yes, anger breeds anger, until finally it sweeps over all age groups.
The U.S. saw its first generation gap as the silent generation began to adopt rebellion as fashion.
This student is wearing an ankle bracelet, dungarees, and dropped earrings. Open shirt, black jacket, dungarees are mentioned in the code as not proper school attire. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt and tight sweater. Off-the-shoulder dresses or earrings are considered improper for school wear.
And this was the moment James Dean stepped into when he immortalized himself at the age of 24 on September 30th, 1955.
His name was Dean, future bright.
James Byron Dean was born in Marion, Indiana on February 8th, 1931. At age 6, his father, Winton Dean, decided to leave the farm life and move the family out to California. The Deans lived in Santa Monica for a few years until mother Mildred became stricken with uterine cancer and passed away at age 28. Winton felt he was unequipped to be a single parent, and so Jimmy was shipped back to Indiana to be raised by his aunt and uncle. After graduating high school, Jimmy returned to SoCal in an effort to reconnect with his father, but this didn't quite pan out as he'd hoped. In the meantime, he appeared in the Miles Playhouse production of The Ballad of Scarlet Gulch in the summer of 1949 under the name Byron James. In the fall of 1950, he enrolled at UCLA, where he was seen in the drama department production of Macbeth. On December 14th, he landed his first paid acting gig, a commercial for Pepsi, which was shot in one day at Griffith Park.
Let's join the Pepsi crowd. Pepsi-Cola.
That very day, Jimmy met Isabel Dressimer, an agent who was impressed with his youthful good looks and agreed to represent him. The producers of the commercial were also impressed with his boy-next-door quality and asked Jimmy to come to the studio the next day to film a second spot, this now famous Pepsi commercial.
The $10 bill he had to show for it was enough to give Jimmy the confidence he needed to drop out of school to pursue acting full-time by February 1951. Holy Cross Family Ministries and their media arm Family Theater Productions are the predecessor to PureFlex, producing Christian media in-house and distributing independently. Starting with a radio program in 1947, Family Theater made the leap to television by 1951. Hill No. 1 was an Easter special that aired on March 25th. Though the role of John the Apostle was a minor one, Jimmy managed to play his handful of inane lines to the hilt.
Do you remember when he fed the multitudes by the sea, multiplying the loaves and fishes?
Yes, I was there. And I. And John here was among them.
Yes, I was there. And later on, gathered the fragments left by the 5,000.
I suggest we leave these precincts and go back to Galilee, where we belong.
Good suggestion, Andrew. Well spoken, Andrew. Now that's wisdom.
Surely we did not spend 3 years following the Master, to return again to our nets. Was it for this the Master sent us out to cure the sick, cast out devils?
Save John here, who would have followed the Master's very footsteps.
A group of girls from Immaculate Heart High School took particular notice and formed the Immaculate Heart James Dean Appreciation Society. Jimmy was reportedly touched to learn he had his first fan club and even accepted an invitation to one of their meetings.
You know, I wish somebody'd love me.
Somebody will. Takes all kinds of women to make a world.
Well, if you're going to take her to dance, how come you haven't asked her before?
No sense to it.
Well, you sure got a lot of nerve. You know, when I want to take a girl to dance, I'll ask her, a month ahead of time, so if she doesn't want to go, I can ask a couple dozen more.
Well, that's because you don't understand women, son. You got to keep them guessing right up to the last minute.
No kidding?
Sure. Women are peculiar people. Once they feel they can depend on you, then they're not interested anymore. So you got to be completely undependable.
Yeah, I guess so.
Got it, Gramps.
Hey, Gramps, I'll have a chalk malt. Heavy on the chalk, plenty of milk, 4 spoons of malt, 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream, 1 mixed with the rest, and 1 floating.
Jimmy picked up some more TV work and a few bit parts and features. But by 1952, Marlon Brando and The Method were the hot ticket in town.
Sure.
An entry into the Actors Studio in New York was seen as the surest bet for the unknown looking to break out. That summer, Jimmy was one of 15 accepted out of 150 tryouts. A few months in, when Strasberg dressed him down mercilessly in front of the rest of the class, after a reading of Matador, Jimmy withdrew, returning only to audit classes from time to time. Meanwhile, that summer, he began a campaign to charm his way into Broadway producer Lemuel Ayers' world, worming his way into a spot as crewman on his yacht. A month later, Ayers held tryouts for his next production, See the Jaguar. Jimmy's politicking gave him a leg up over the estimated 100 actors jockeying for the part of Wally Wilkins, a 17-year-old who'd spent his upbringing isolated and abused at the hands of his mother. After her death, Wally struggles to interact with the outside world for the first time, and whispers of a sizable inheritance make him the target of exploitation. William Hawkins of the World Telegram and Sun describes See the Jaguar as
a play of poetic quality.
A perhaps charitable way to describe playwright J. Richard Nash's free-form dialogue, which Lee Mortimer of the Daily Mirror predicted
would gag a YMCA social director.
John Chapman of the Daily News noted,
"It is a pity that one small ingredient was left out. The ingredient I mention is a play, and a play is no more than a believable story."
The New York Post's Richard Watts Jr. summed it up as
full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times proclaimed,
See the Jaguar accomplishes nothing but noise and confusion.
See the Jaguar opened December 3rd, 1952 at the Court Theater and shut down December 6th after 5 performances. But while the show was an unqualified flop, the Post noted,
James Dean achieves the feat of making the childish young fugitive believable and unembarrassing.
Walter Kerr of the Herald Tribune stated,
James Dean adds an extraordinary performance in an almost impossible role.
The Mirror remarked,
No show is complete without a character actor that's the show. This has two, namely Roy Fant as Grandpa Rix and James Dean.
Have you been in a play on Broadway in the last 2 years?
Yeah, I'd say that, sure.
A Frenchman in a play, was it a legitimate play?
Yeah, it was.
Was it a serious play?
Rather, yeah.
Was it a play that was adapted from a story of André Gide's called The Immoralist?
Yes, it was.
Well, I never believed you could do that kind of an accent, Louis Jourdan.
At the end of 1953, Jimmy landed his second and final Broadway role. The Immoralist was another controversial production for its day. It centers around Michel, played by Louis Jourdan, who marries a woman in hopes of resolving his repressed but all-consuming homosexuality. Jimmy plays Bashir, the couple's flamboyantly gay houseboy who continuously seduces and taunts Michel, eventually provoking him to consummate his marriage to prove his manhood. From there, things descend into tragedy for the newlyweds. Once again, Jimmy was singled out by the critics, but he wouldn't stick around long. He put in his notice shortly after The Immoralist opened on February 8th, 1954, and gave his last performance February 23rd. He'd walked away from a hit production and burned his bridge with producer Billy Rose, one of the biggest power brokers on Broadway at the time, on the basis of a handshake agreement with Elia Kazan to be cast in an upcoming film adaptation of John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Kazan had established himself as the method actor's director after helming Streetcar Named Desire in 1951. Kazan and Brando teamed up for another Steinbeck adaptation, Viva Zapata, in 1952, and again for On the Waterfront in 1954. Brando was Hollywood's golden child, and Elia Kazan was regarded as the star maker behind him.
It's the point of whether I go for the girls, though, you know.
Oh, you think the girls go for Jim?
Oh,
Look
great.
at him. Size him up.
Kiss me. Can't hear.
On April 7th, 1954, Jimmy signed with Warner Bros. At a starting salary of $1,000 a week. Jack Warner was anything but pleased with his newest acquisition. Jimmy was slovenly, uncultured in their eyes, undisciplined, and often defiant. But Warner couldn't ignore the reality that he was getting his clock cleaned by the little studio that could, Columbia. Warner Bros. Put Marlon Brando on the map with Streetcar Named Desire, but failed to lock him into a contract at the time. He recognized Jimmy's potential as Warner Bros. Answer to Brando, and saw that losing out on the chance to snag him meant running the risk of diminished relevance. Most coverage of Jimmy over the summer of 1955 focused on comparisons to Marlon Brando. Sidney Skolsky was a columnist who worked out of an office above Schwab's on Sunset. After publicists pushed an urban legend that Lana Turner had been discovered there by chance, Schwab's Drug, along with Googie's restaurant next door, famously became a magnet for aspiring unknowns hoping to get noticed. In a piece titled Demon Dean from the July 1955 issue of Photoplay, Skolsky follows Jimmy, whose profile was only just beginning to rise after the release of East of Eden, along with an entourage of admiring no-names and hangers-on, as they hang out one night. In line with most pieces on Jimmy at the time, Marlon Brando is mentioned no less than 14 times in the article. Skolsky attempts to qualify the comparison.
Dean resembles Brando because they both represent today. Jimmy, you must understand, has character and integrity. He is also undisciplined and irresponsible. He is Marlon Brando 7 years ago. There's the refusal to conform to accepted patterns, right to the motorcycle.
Skolsky adds,
Brando's only comment, as far as I know, was made at a party attended by both. Marlon said to Jimmy, "Don't you think you're going a little too far to attract attention?"
One of the few in-depth profiles published in his lifetime, Demon Dean and its portrait of Jimmy as a motorcycle-riding, bongo drum-beating, convention-defying, jive-spewing hepcat would go on to be a foundational text in the lore of the James Dean myth.
His name was Dean, future bright, until he...
I think I'd better take off.
Oh, wait a minute, Jimmy. One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine. You know?
The dead was James Byron Dean, DOA, or dead on arrival at the hospital.
Throughout the month of October 1955, news reports of Jimmy's death along with a spate of columns mourning his untimely loss appeared on newsstands alongside Warner Bros. Puff pieces in fan magazines which had already been scheduled for publication, while East of Eden, which had come out that April, did good business at the box office and had garnered him a measure of attention. He wasn't quite yet a household name. For many, the media hype surrounding his sudden passing was their introduction to James Dean, and the morbid duality of the tragic news alongside heavily sanitized get-to-know Jimmy articles promoting his next movie became the incantation to summon Hollywood's latest god. The studios had been refining the craft of capitalizing on dead actors for decades, making the most out of posthumous releases like The Son of Chic, which came out a year after the death of its star, Rudolph Valentino. The ice cream blonde Thelma Todd was found unresponsive at 29 under suspicious circumstances in 1935, but that didn't hurt ticket sales for The Bohemian Girl the following year.
Well, how about it?
Well, it's a great idea, but do you think that I'm doing the right thing?
And the original Platinum Blonde, Jean Harlow's untimely passing, only helped make Saratoga, released 7 weeks later, the top-earning film of 1937.
I'll bet my farm on it.
The picture which the theatergoers of the world have insisted, through letters, telegrams, and petitions, be finished.
The spectacular production, thousands of theatergoers demanded that the studio complete and release with Jean Harlow, has been finished. Through ingenious camera work by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's ace photographers and the determination of the producers to make this, Miss Harlow's last picture, her finest, a great production awaits your approval.
Will you leave us alone 1 minute?
Looking to MGM's windfall off the lateness of the late Jean Harlow, Warner Bros. Set out to zero in on the sweet spot. Too soon, and they run the risk of blatantly crass commercialism diminishing the value of their asset. But the longer they wait, the higher the likelihood the public moves on and the studio is left with nothing.
Here's the inspiration of the picture we saw last night.
Wait a minute, Walter. Rebel Without a Cause isn't about slum kids.
No, but slum kids started the thinking. We took a look into some privileged homes, far from the slums. Nice homes, very respectable. No slum kids here. But beneath the surface?
Trouble. Plenty of it.
Greenlit as a B-movie in spite of being their attempt to respond to the success of The Wild One and Blackboard Jungle, Rebel Without a Cause was shot on lower-cost black and white when it went into production on March 28, 1955. Jimmy's next project, Giant, set to be filmed that summer, was his prestige vehicle, with A-list co-stars and a large-scale budget to match. As efforts to liken him to Brando started picking up traction in the press on the heels of East of Eden's release, Jack Warner approved an upgrade to CinemaScope color. Reshoots put the production somewhat behind schedule, but his instinct had once again served him well. Cinematographer Ernest Haller incorporated the same striking use of color that won him the Academy Award for Gone with the Wind. Marketing materials for the rushed release placed its deceased star front and center, and the image of Jimmy in a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and blood-red Harrington windbreaker was beyond iconic. It was transcendent. Rebel Without a Cause first premiered at the Astor Theater in New York on October 26, 1955. Exhibitors were given 3 days ahead of time to pre-screen, pointing to the hurried nature of the release. It might not have been the highest-grossing film of that year. That would have been Mr. Roberts, which raked in $8.1 million, and it may have been dwarfed by Giant's $12 million in ticket sales the following year. But without question, Rebel Without a Cause is the film that made James Dean a cultural institution. The style, mannerisms, and affect depicted in the character of Jim Stark set the first ever universal standard of cool for the modern adolescent male. The title itself is the perfect encapsulation of the frustrations teens often face when pressed to explain themselves. Giant would further establish James Dean as an icon of Americana by stylizing him in the aesthetic of arguably the most American of all archetypes, the cowboy. But Rebel Without a Cause made him both immediately relevant and instantly timeless.
Matt, there's no need to go through the whole thing. I cheated, and I'd admit it.
Well, what if there were others?
Others?
Yeah, who cheated? Would that make any difference?
Huh? Look, Jim. If there are others who cheated, you're on your honor to tell us who they are.
No, I'm not.
As fandom made a hard shift into idolatry, almost anyone that could claim even the flimsiest connection to James Dean was coming out of the woodwork to cash in. On top of endless tribute columns and articles flooding newspapers and magazines, special edition one-offs with names like The James Dean Album, The Official James Dean Anniversary Book, and The Real James Dean Story were churned out by the same New York outfits that published the fan magazines. Friend Bill Bass turned out the first biography in 1956, laying the foundation for the James Dean myth that later works would either support or refute. Meanwhile, weeks after the release of Rebel Without a Cause, RCA signed a recording contract with a 20-year-old singer out of Memphis named Elvis Aaron Presley. By the time rock and roll came into its own over the summer of 1955, Elvis had steadily built up a regional following, performing in a similar style that blended jump blues with country and western. His talent as a showman was bolstered by his taste for flashy outfits, along with dance moves he cribbed equally from black performers and strip dancers.
As you can see, this is so raw, and he's so new. He doesn't know how to move around yet quite. He hadn't got it together. That's why he's pulling up his pants.
In spite of his status as an undocumented and therefore illegal immigrant, Thomas Andrew Parker had been awarded the honorary title of Colonel by the Louisiana State Militia in 1948 by Governor Jimmy Davis for his help on Davis's campaign. And Andreas Cornelis van Queek would go by Colonel Tom Parker for the rest of his days. By early 55, Elvis caught the attention of Colonel Tom, and that summer was featured on the Colonel's Hank Snow tour.
Well, at the time that I started singing, Colonel Tom Parker was managing Hank Snow.
I see.
And that's how we got connected. I don't know why Hank and my name were linked together so much, because actually we wasn't connected in any way in business.
Colonel Tom then took it upon himself to broker a deal to sign Elvis to a major label and began shopping around. In the eye of the hurricane that was the James Dean phenomenon, RCA saw the marketability in Elvis and won out the bidding war. And on January 27th, 1956, Heartbreak Hotel was released.
Although it's so it's crowded, you still can find some room.
The following day, Colonel Tom had arranged for Elvis to make his first national TV appearance on Stage Show.
Well, get out of that kitchen and rattle those pots and pans.
Whisper was one of a handful of rogue tabloids in the 50s that sidestepped the studio-driven media machine in favor of more lurid and sensationalistic copy. The cover story for the February 1956 issue was one of the earliest incidents of the James Dean myth taking on a paranormal dimension. James Dean's Black Madonna makes the claim that James Dean was killed by a curse put on him by Vampira, a fictional TV character, after their brief affair ended in disappointment. It's worth noting that the article never mentions the name of the woman who portrayed Vampira, Mila Nurmi, and refers to her by her on-camera pseudonym throughout. But the pairing of his image with hyperbolic, gothic, and occult imagery was perhaps the first sign of a darker turn towards the cult of James Dean.
Joe, what were you doing?
Reading, Nolly, the place you told me.
Jimmy Dean Returns was a one-off from the publishers of Rave magazine that promises to offer his own words from the beyond. Instead, the reader is treated to fan fiction written pseudonymously as Judy Collins, an 18-year-old working at Macy's in New York in 1951 when Jimmy comes into the store. What starts out as the purchase of a can opener blossoms into a romance for the ages until Hollywood comes between the two. After their last kiss, Jimmy promises,
"No matter what happens to me, somehow or other, sometime, somewhere, I'll come back to you. Remember, I'll come back to you."
After Jimmy dies, Judy pads out the article by elaborating on her newfound interest in hypnosis through exhaustive reviews of multiple books she'd come across, along with an article from the October 1949 Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, quoted in full. All of this sets up the pretext for Jimmy talking to Judy by way of a small travel clock. By June, Newsweek, Movie Life, and other outlets began to run articles denying rumors that James Dean had, in fact, survived his car crash, but was so disfigured from the accident he has since gone into hiding. Whether or not it's true, as some have claimed, that Warner Bros. Press team planted the story to keep interest alive until the release of Giant. Some of the suits became uneasy with the cult's growing fascination with the death aspect. The image of the crumpled wreckage of the spider became a holy symbol unto its own, the crucifix to which James Dean had been nailed. The prospect of teenage devotees tempting fate like their idol, with grave results, gave parents yet another reason to deride and fear their youth. Meanwhile, the fact that Jimmy had no will meant that by default, his estate, at the time of his death valued to be around $100,000, went to his surviving next of kin, which was his semi-estranged father, Winton Dean. In July, he and the Dean family incorporated the James Dean Memorial Foundation, and later the James Dean Foundation Trust, to manage licensing, kicking off a decades-long legal battle with Warner Bros. Over who holds the rights to an individual's name and likeness after they're gone. In hopes of containing the monster they'd created, the Hollywood machine activated a two-pronged campaign. One, tarnish the image of James Dean, the all-American farm boy, through a succession of leaked stories about his more sordid behavior. And two, paint the fans as delusional weirdos with whom no self-respecting high schooler should want to associate themselves. One headline in the LA Mirror from August 6, 1956 read, "Continued fascination assumes macabre aspect." A September 24th article in Time magazine, "Delirium over a Dead Star," referred to the fandom as a morbid cult. That same month, broader fears over the teen menace boiled over when Elvis made his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, September 9th, where the camera crew was famously ordered to shoot him from the waist up in order to shield CBS's audience from the hypersexuality of the pelvis.
Mr. Sullivan? We know that somewhere out there that you're looking at, and
Not long after, Sullivan learned that Steve Allen was working on a tribute to James Dean scheduled to air October 21st, and cynically ran one of his own a week prior. Irate and not to be outdone, Allen produced a tribute album, The James Dean Story, that Coral Records released the same day Allen's special aired. On October 28th, Saturday Evening Post writer Maurice Zolotow ran a syndicated column that newspapers across the country ran with alternating headlines.
Jimmy Dean should be no one's idol. Late actor was sadistic, uncouth, arrogant, cruel, and a filthy slob.
Or,
Jimmy Dean called rotten idol for the U.S.
Or,
legend is based on lies and nonsense.
The Detroit Free Press ran a column alongside Zolotow's from Kitty Hansen, headlined,
Are Dean fans buying a phony idol? There's profit in pushing the Dean hoax.
The hoax being gullible teenagers, enriching those capitalizing on their fervent devotion to the James Dean cult via merchandising. The December 59 issue of Esquire included an article, The Apotheosis of James Dean, which contains quotes from two primary sources. Christine White, Jimmy's audition partner and classmate at the Actors Studio, and frenemy Leonard Rosenman.
One of his closest friends for a time was Leonard Rosenman, who composed the brilliant musical scores for Rebel and East of Eden.
By all accounts, Jimmy made Rosenman's lengthy career as a film composer happen by convincing Warner Bros. To let him score East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause. At some point, and for reasons never made clear, the two had a falling out. Up to his death in 2008, Rosenman himself remained cagey on the matter, yet somehow still found it in his heart to jump at every paid interview or Dean-related project he was approached to participate in.
Extraordinary. Yeah, at the end you were no longer friends. Why did it break up?
Well, several reasons. Without being too personal about it, I felt that the role that Jimmy expected me to play in his life, I simply couldn't play, which was that of a father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Jimmy had a fantasy about his father. And if Jimmy didn't have a fantasy about his father, if this was the real relationship with his father, this warm, loving kind of thing, I don't think he'd want to go and play basketball with me as his father.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And
that just came out of some sort of rejection. No?
Yeah, I think so.
While he never directly disparaged Jimmy on camera, Rosenman often framed their relationship in a patronizing and self-aggrandizing fashion.
Len, you're a serious composer, an intellectual, How did you strike up a friendship with someone as primitive as James Dean?
This mutual friend asked me to write music to a production which was done in New York, which happened to star Jimmy Dean. And Jimmy evidently liked the music. I had met Jimmy, but I didn't remember him after the performance. He arrived at my doorstep and asked if I'd teach him piano. And I didn't remember who he was. He wanted to be a kind of an intellectual. I really don't know how deep that was, actually. And that's why, of course, he went into analysis toward the end of his life.
In his article, Was James Dean Sexually Sadistic?, Jason Colavito asserts that their rift was due to Jimmy publicly exposing Rosenman's infidelity towards his first of 4 wives, Adele Bracker. This is supported by the fact that the two had divorced at some point prior to Rosenman's marriage to wife number 2, Kay Scott, in 1959.
Without being too personal about it,
Warner Brothers are proud and pleased to present Mr. George Stevens' great production of Giant. Yes, I said it. Giant. Hey, Sugar.
Yes?
Here is a guy that's as big as Texas in Giant, and such a performance, and he has his lovely lady with us here tonight. You see them off stage. Would you give them a nice introduction like you always do?
Must be only Rock Hudson. Hello, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
I want to meet your wife. Hello. So nice to meet you, Phyllis. You want to step in here? All right. Thank you. And I was told you, I think he's wonderful.
Good show, Rod.
Thank you, Phil.
Good show, Mrs. Hudson.
Thank you.
On November 24th, 1956, Giant was released to commercial and critical acclaim. Warner Bros. Gambit ended with a blowout, netting tens of millions for the studio, and, as a bonus, they were off the hook for the 8 films and the $800,000 salary left in his contract. But they figured once this gusher dried up, with no more product to peddle, James Dean would now retire to Hollywood heaven alongside Valentino and Harlow. The same week Giant came out, Elvis made his silver screen debut in Love Me Tender. While music had always been central to him, Elvis, like many kids, grew up dreaming of becoming a movie star. Knowing this, Colonel Tom set out to make it happen, and soon after signing Elvis to RCA, brokered a one-picture deal with Paramount that included an option for 6 more. Awestruck at his effectiveness, 21-year-old Elvis made Colonel Tom his full-time manager, entering into an agreement that would effectively condemn him to indentured servitude down the road. But having already conquered pop music, Elvis now proved himself as a viable box office commodity. His unpolished but undeniably radioactive charisma on camera, combined with his status as the leading force of rock and roll in the moment, made Elvis Presley the indisputable heir apparent to James Dean, whether or not he would admit it himself.
There have been a lot of articles come out that I was going to imitate or copy the late James Dean or something like that, but I've never thought about it. Although James Dean was one of the greatest actors I've ever seen, he and Marlon Brando and a whole bunch more I could call over. But I'm not going to try to copy anybody.
They predict that Elvis Presley will be another James Dean. Now, have you heard that?
I've heard something about it, but I would never compare myself in any way to James Dean because James Dean was a genius.
A February 1957 article in the non-studio sanctioned gossip rag Inside Story, headlined The James Dean Hoax, includes several unsubstantiated claims that Warner Bros. Artificially inflated hype over James Dean during the summer of 1956 by, among other things, paying fan clubs to force enthusiasm despite alleged waning interest. It is believed that the anonymous insider source for the article was Walter Ross, a New York-based publicist who had a particular distaste for Jimmy going back to his Broadway days. Ross went on to publish a novel in 1958, The Immortal, in which the main character of 24-year-old Johnny Preston is a thinly veiled stand-in for James Dean, portrayed in an especially unsavory light.
Speaking of rhythms, this young man is famous in Hollywood not only for his acting, but also for his hobby. Between takes, Marlon Brando is the main attraction on this set.
Whether or not the James Dean hoax contains any truths, it may be so that the fever over Dean mania had cooled some by 1957, but the James Dean cult remained evergreen. A poor quality home recording of Jimmy jamming on conga with Bob Romeo on flute was released as a single as Dean's Lament. On the B-side, Jungle Rhythm, they are joined by the King of Palm Springs, Duke Mitchell, on bawangos.
That guy's a professional.
Ironically, Duke and Jimmy had both worked as extras on the Martin and Lewis comedy Sailor Beware, back during Jimmy's first go-around as a no-name in Hollywood. But a barely audible 5 minutes of James Dean hitting the skins wasn't enough to satisfy the lingering appetite, and reports of a biopic in the works began to trickle out. Much of the discussion revolved around who would be cast in the lead, with reader polls tilting heavily in favor of Elvis. A Kansas City-based filmmaker took notice of the demand to see his life story presented on the big screen and came up with an approach that would be far more cost-effective and at the same time benefit from its authenticity. In between producing industrial shorts, Robert Altman was directing his first feature film, The Delinquents, when Jimmy died. Altman saw the James Dean phenomenon as an essential entry into the catalog of Americana, a subject area that would become a through line of his work in years to come. Altman marshaled the resources he had on hand and began work on a documentary. But aside from a handful of on-camera interviews and some unremarkable B-roll from Fairmount, Altman had little to work with in the way of footage. His solution was what he called dynamic exploration of the photograph, which is basically using zoom, pan, and tilt to create a sense of motion with a still image. On August 13th, 1957, the James Dean story premiered in Marion, Indiana, Dean's birthplace. Warner Bros. Was pleased enough with Robert Altman's finished product that they decided to scrap plans for a biopic and distribute his film instead. Given the considerable limitations of his resources and access, the James Dean story is far less factual documentary and far more impressionistic treatise, with a heavy dose of armchair psychoanalysis.
See, now most of us put a wall around it. Mirrors like this, see? If we don't trust people, we use it to keep them out so they can't hurt us. Mirrors aren't enough for you. You've got to have this, too, a second wall. And it's all covered with thorns and spangles and shockers to dazzle people so they say, boy, he's really a hot apple. Look how interesting he is. You never say, hey, step right this way and see the real Jimmy Dean. So what's hiding in the middle, Jimmy? Why do you shut people out? Why don't you think you deserve anything? You think you're so dull that if they get inside they won't find anything and they'll walk out on you? Is that why you run out on them before they get too close? Do you think you're empty, Jimmy?
Lacquered with stylization that aimed for ultra-hip, including a soundtrack that featured then-popular jazz artists Chet Baker and Bud Shank. In the end, the James Dean story would crystallize the version of the James Dean myth that Warner Bros. And the James Dean Memorial Trust could market to all ages. The Renaissance man who epitomized cool, but could never escape the shadow of losing his mother at 9 years old. On October 10th, the Greater Los Angeles Safety Council first exhibited the wreckage of James Dean's Porsche Spider in conjunction with a screening of the James Dean story.
Hey! It's Porsche!
Porsche or Porsche? I say Porsche. I've always said Porsche. I don't know that much about Porsches or cars in general, but it's not because I don't pronounce it the way you think it should be pronounced.
In German, we say Porsche.
In English-speaking countries, you simply do not have that sound. You don't have that sound. The E is silent, and you say Porsche. It's just a bit silly, really. I mean, ultimately, I really don't care how you say Porsche or Porsche, but if you're going to pronounce it the German way, then don't say Porsche, because that is wrong as well.
George Barris had purchased the remains of the Porsche he'd customized days before the crash by emblazoning the rear with the nickname Little Bastard. Unable to rebuild it, Barris sold off the drivetrain and loaned out the body and chassis to the Safety Council. While the clear hope was that Dean heads would become mortified at seeing firsthand the reality of his recklessness and think twice about following in his footsteps. At an exhibit in Sacramento, the car reportedly slid off its display and crushed one attendee's hip. At another exhibit, it slipped during setup and killed George Barkis, a truck driver hired to help transport it. Several people claim to have cut themselves just by touching the body. A number of other freak occurrences related to parts Barris had sold off added to the consensus that Little Bastard was cursed, another supernatural element that only added to the mystique. While Warner Bros. Were content enough that the James Dean story had satisfied the fandom, one studio felt otherwise and went to work on their response immediately after its release. South Carolina-based Howco Productions boasted the distinction of having worked with both B-movie juggernaut Roger Corman and the so-called worst director of all time, Ed Wood. The narrator in Lost, Lonely, and Vicious melodramatically proclaims,
"In this town of make-believe, the truth behind the scenes is also filled with drama. This is a realistic documentary of how one young actor struggles with life. Our story deals with the motivation of a young star obsessed with death. Perhaps it is God's way. But herein, real actors and actresses in this lost and lonely world give an honest portrayal, not on the great sound stages, but on actual location."
And while Altman may have made the trip to Fairmount, Indiana for the James Dean story, Howco Productions' Hollywood documentary was shot entirely on location in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
You like movies?
I can take him or leave him.
This one has a new actor. I read a lot about him in the magazines. They say he's kind of strange.
I guess I act kind of odd sometimes.
You're not a criminal, are you?
No, but I'll give it my consideration.
You're him!
Oh.
Him! Johnny Dennis!
But instead of a documentary, Lost, Lonely, and Vicious is a dramatization that follows a gifted but tortured rising star named Johnny Dennis, whose obsession with death ends in tragedy.
At the hangout for coffee sessions, their world revolves around the stage. And with people whose work is pretending, realism is confusing.
Norman Graham's script appears to be heavily informed by Sidney Skolsky's Demon Dean article. Much of the film takes place in a sparsely adorned cafe, where Dennis's circle of hangers-on loiter, clearly cribbing from the same scene at Googie's, Skolsky describes.
You ever run out of dialogue?
Not when I'm talking to a dish like you. You know, some things are cheap in this town.
Especially phonies.
Oh, who's a phony? Listen, doll, one of these days I'm going to be big. Big!
Lost, Lonely, and Vicious played the drive-in circuit on a double bill with My World Dies Screaming, and while box office information isn't available, it's fair to assume it turned a profit.
Okay, you're never wrong.
On March 24th, 1958, Elvis Presley reported to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, for induction into the Army. With the king of rock and roll shipped overseas for the next 2 years, parents breathed a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare of rock and roll and rebels without causes was finally over.
I didn't want to record songs like Tutti Frutti and other songs like that don't make a lot of sense, you know, but the recording director went out, thank goodness. He told me to go ahead and do it because it was going to be a hit. So I said, all right, I didn't believe it, but we went ahead and recorded it anyway. And it was a hit. It was a hit.
But armed with The Catcher in the Rye as their manifesto, the kids now began to see right through top-down efforts to fill the vacuum left by Elvis with prefabricated teen dream products like Pat Boone, Frankie Avalon, and Fabian.
Do you have great appeal for the young?
And while the press and the public may have christened him the next James Dean, to Hollywood's acting community, Elvis Presley was seen as a hick being propped up as a novelty who never had to pay his dues, and as such was an interloper and illegitimate in their eyes as an actor. As rumors and half-truths continued to circulate among insiders, the James Dean myth remained a uniquely intoxicating proposition around young Hollywood. In one article, Dennis Hopper, who had minor roles in Rebel Without a Cause and Giant, implored readers,
"Please don't call me another Jimmy Dean,"
adding how much he shrinks inside when the press and the studio moguls allegedly draw the comparison. One of the cast of Rebel who would have happily accepted it was Nick Adams, whose unabashed efforts to mold himself after his co-star culminated in 1959, when he landed the role in an ABC Western for 2 seasons. Even the show's title, The Rebel, was an unsubtle attempt to tie itself and its star to the Deaniverse.
There's wars that don't end just because a white flag goes up. Somebody signs a piece of paper. There's wars that go on inside.
Apart from promising young actors at the time, like Paul Newman and Tab Hunter, the nomination of Tony Perkins for Next James Dean seems like an unlikely choice through a contemporary lens, given his career-defining role of Norman Bates in the Psycho movies.
Win, Jimmy, win. That's all you ever cared about. And you're killing me. You've been killing me for years. Yes, you haven't. It's too much.
Another odd pick for those more familiar with his work as lip-syncing villain clown Ben in David Lynch's Blue Velvet, or as extra-dimensional spirit guide Al Calavici on NBC's primetime sci-fi nostalgia porn hybrid Quantum Leap, was Dean Stockwell.
How could you pass up the chance? I'm not a sniveling kid anymore, and nobody's going to talk to me that way, new or nobody.
The November 1958 photoplay article, Can Dean Stockwell Shake Off the Jimmy Dean Jinx?, opens with Stockwell surviving a relatively minor traffic accident in a Renault unscathed. From there, it continues to explore Stockwell's frustration at supposedly unsolicited comparisons to James Dean, albeit while neglecting to cite any sources.
Sure, there were some likenesses, but that didn't stop the magazine writers from trying to get Stockwell into the Jimmy Dean mold, and it hurt. He wanted to be accepted for his own abilities, but the magazines wouldn't let him. They harped on the similarities between the two, manufactured others where they didn't exist.
After finger-wagging the coverage coming out of other magazines, the magazine article then lingers on each of these alleged commonalities, half-heartedly refuting or qualifying them with a yeah, but.
Like Stockwell, he was crazy about bar talk, but his first love, as everyone knows, were the bongo drums.
Are you afraid of me?
I'm afraid for you, Judd. I'm afraid for you.
Oh, my God. Are you the
Lucille LeSueur, Francis Gum, Marion Morrison, Archibald Leach, Norma Jean Mortensen, Natalia Zakharenko, Alfonso de Bruzio, Maurice Micklewhite, Vicki Lynn Hogan, Margaret Hyra, Mark Sinclair, Eric Bishop, Carlos Estevez.
Movie Stars magazine, the same Madison Avenue operative that gave us the Jimmy Dean Memorial Album, ran a piece in their March 1959 issue, The Boy Who Followed Jimmy Dean to Death. The bulk of the text is lifted word for word out of Associated Press cables from months earlier, but it's noteworthy for including the most complete version of the only available autobiography of Tom Pittman. The press kit for his final film and only starring vehicle, High School Big Shot, includes a fluff-to-the-point of dubious biography of its lead. His page on findagrave.com includes a memorial with some additional information. Yet despite being barely more than a paragraph each, many of the handful of details available manage to contradict each other. In the 66 years that have passed since then, the story of Tom Pittman has been reduced to a footnote on the periphery of the James Dean lore and a running gag in an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Those lips.
What difference does it make?
He has a haunting ugliness.
You didn't know him.
If someone asks, who is Tom Pittman, his Wikipedia page might satisfy them enough. But it's the story of Jerry Lee Alten that can offer some real insight into the nature of stardom, idolatry, and the mechanics of the Hollywood machine. And it's one that's been nearly lost to time altogether. A story with a number of dead ends and still unanswered questions. A story buried under layers of commercialism and self-serving misdirection. So for the first time ever, let's try and get to know Jerry Lee Alten, best known professionally as Tom Pittman, and sometimes Jeff Parrish. What we know for certain is that Jerry Lee Altenberger was born March 16, 1932 in Phoenix, Arizona. His father, Frank, was born Franz von Altenberger in Vienna, Austria on May 7, 1907. According to his naturalization records, Frank lived in Czechoslovakia before immigrating to the U.S. October 17, 1927. Jerry's mother, Beulah Dahlia Corey, was born in Fort Scott, Kansas, March 25, 1910. Frank and Beulah married June 18, 1931 in Los Angeles, relocating to Phoenix by the time Jerry was born, nearly 9 months to the date after their wedding night. When Frank applied for U.S. citizenship on March 1st, 1935, the couple were still married, and his occupation was listed as bartender. However, the marriage would dissolve within the next couple years. Beulah married her second husband, Eugene Bill Adair of Los Angeles, and the two gave birth to Jerry's half-sister Paula in 1939 in Yuma, Arizona. According to vital records, Beulah was a resident of California from 1939 through the rest of her life, and specifically Los Angeles County from 1941 onward. In 1953, she married for the third and final time to Stanislaw Stanley Jodzio. Meanwhile, Frank shortened his last name to Alten as early as 1933, in his earliest known mention as a professional entertainer, billing himself as a world-famous magician at a children's benefit for the Sierra Madre PTA, where he appeared alongside the big butter and egg man, Colonel McWhifflegigger. In 1937, he was part of a cast of puppeteers in a Christmas show at the Pasadena Auditorium. Another article from 1942 has the well-known magician performing for another youth benefit in Pasadena. A profile from 1943 notes Frank has turned movie actor portraying Nazi villain officers for Hollywood films by day while manufacturing armaments in Lockheed's Burbank factory by night. The piece also identifies Frank as Count Franz von Altenburger. Frank would routinely claim, without proof, to be an Austrian count by birth.
There's a way to settle this immediately. Come.
Frank did a number of uncredited bit parts through the 40s, mostly in Poverty Row productions.
Spice Masher. Take him to the Gestapo dungeon.
His sole screen credit was in Republic Pictures' Sci-Fi meets Gangbusters meets Pirates serial Manhunt of Mystery Island in 1945.
Time up.
To use this office. Can you finish up later?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
That September, he opened a nightclub in Studio City called Emerald Cove. In 1948, he launched the Standard Directory, which marketed itself as a centralized telephone directory for Hollywood talent. In 1954, Frank was swindled by a bunco artist named Vincent Lamb, who posed as the producer of a fake game show called Crossword of the Air. In the process of buttering him up, Lamb stole a $1,500 diamond ring from Frank, along with bouncing a check to a hotel for $50. At Lamb's trial for grand theft and forgery, a number of Hollywood figures were implicated in the scheme, including actor Ken Murray and red-haired television showgirl Dorothy Ford. A Saturday children's special at the 1955 Mid-Valley Fair in Panorama City was reported as
Frank Alten, a clown, will present his trained ducks and dogs at 3 p.m.
Remember, the clowns at the circus, they're real funny. But on the highway, they're murder.
So, with Frank and Beulah documented to have lived in California from 1939 onward, you may be wondering, what happened to Jerry? Did he stay with either parent after their divorce? Did the two work out a co-parenting arrangement?
Do you remember exactly what happened the day you were 4 years old?
I had a birthday party.
Did anything unpleasant happen at that party?
I poured ink on my sister.
The fact that Jerry graduated high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1950 suggests he did not follow them to the West Coast, leaving open the possibilities of being raised by extended family, adoption, orphanage, and or the juvenile justice system. His senior yearbook offers some clues. He was involved in a number of extracurricular activities, including cheerleading, math, track, and of course, theater. To me, this pro-social engagement, combined with the fact that he graduated at 17 and therefore was presumably never held back, indicates that whatever his circumstances may have been, he'd found a way to adapt to some extent.
How are you going to get your college education? How are you going to satisfy your military obligation? The Coast Guard Academy at New London, Connecticut offers you both opportunities at no cost.
Following graduation, Jerry enlisted in the Coast Guard for 2 years, which is what likely brought him to the Portland, Oregon area. On March 27, 1952, Jerry was gunning his motorcycle loudly down Southwest Broadway. As he passed 6th Street, a police officer tried to flag him down. Jerry instead barreled straight towards him, missing him by inches. After giving chase for a few minutes, Jerry was arrested and jailed for reckless driving.
I was naughty.
What did you do?
No, Pa, no. We was just talking about being married.
Don't you lie to me. You was playing like you already was.
On July 26, 1952, Jerry married 18-year-old Carol Johnson of Milwaukee. 6 months later, on February 12, 1953, the two gave birth to a daughter, Teresa. 3 months after that, on June 15th, Carol was granted a divorce on the grounds of cruelty.
It's a good start for a marriage. Well, here's to marrying young.
Why can't we go on as three?
A very charming lady named Sally Kellerman, who, of course, you must have seen in the film MASH, apart from anything else.
I have so many messages for the Queen.
You have messages for the Queen? Who from?
Oh, from my niece and her cat and her grandmother, and you know,
And what is the
a
message?
lot of friends of mine.
What is the message?
I guess just hello, you know. Keep up the good work, you know.
In her memoir, Read My Lips, Stories from a Hollywood Life, Sally Kellerman spends the better part of a chapter discussing what she describes as her close friendship with
a fine actor who some people thought was going to be the next James Dean,
named Tom Pittman. While it's clear she's referring to Jerry Lee Alten, who throughout his life never legally changed his abbreviated given name, Sally refers to him exclusively as Tom, or at one point, Tommy. For someone who claims to have an intimate acquaintance and maintains the fondness for him that she seems 2 years later, the erasure altogether of his real name is puzzling. Regrettably, Sally is no longer around to clear some of this up, having passed away in 2022. There are several reasons her recollection of events would be wholly inconsistent with the idea that she knew Jerry only as Tom, not least of which we know with certainty when and where Jerry first began working under his stage name, and her story is contradicted at several points from there. Sally shares her account of how the two came to be acquainted.
I'd met Tom through mutual friends shortly after my family moved to Los Angeles.
Earlier in the book, she clarifies this was
when I was around 15 years old, in the middle of my sophomore year.
Meaning Sally Kellerman, who was born in 1937, began attending Hollywood High in the spring 1953 semester. This implies Jerry would have relocated from Portland to Hollywood very shortly after his divorce in June of 1953, if not sooner.
The first time he had a proper role on live television, on Playhouse 90, he came over to watch it with my parents and me.
Let's start with the obvious question. How can somebody watch themselves perform on live TV? Playhouse 90 was an anthology show that alternated between live teleplays and pre-filmed episodes. However, the first episode of Playhouse 90 premiered October 1956, well after Tom Pittman had made his TV debut, as we'll get to shortly. More so, there's no record I was able to find of him appearing on any episode of Playhouse 90. It's easily possible she confused Playhouse 90 for one of several other anthology series Tom did appear in, such as Suspicion, General Electric Theater, or Studio 57. Sally muddies the waters a little further when she gets to the topic of Frank Alten, who's never mentioned by name.
After the funeral of Tom's father, a small, unimposing Norwegian man came into Chez Paulette. He walked up and introduced himself to me. I know Tommy loved you very much, he said. I didn't know what to say. Tom's father had been a radio and television actor, but as far as I knew, the two were never very close.
Was this correct? On one hand, we've established Jerry had separated from both of his parents somewhere between their divorce in 1935 and the late 40s. But let's take a moment to consider the scenario around June 1953. 21-year-old divorcee and absentee father Jerry Lee Alten decides to go in on pursuing an acting career, armed with a handful of high school credits and 2 years of peacetime service under his belt.
You couldn't pick a better man, Herr Hauptmann. Look at his excellent record.
But while his whereabouts and activities for the 2 years after his divorce remain unconfirmed, Tom Pittman's obituary notes he'd completed his training in theatrical arts from UCLA before being introduced to producer Ivan Tors through his father. This makes it far more plausible that the two had stayed in touch, or that Jerry had at least kept tabs on Frank's entertainment career. It's possible he was attending UCLA when Jerry met Sally, but his TV debut was neither on Playhouse 90 nor under the name Tom Pittman. On August 25th, 1955, he starred in an episode of Lux Video Theater, June Bride, as Jerry Alten. Incidentally, this also means that Jerry and Jimmy Dean even coexisted as working actors in Hollywood for about a month, though there's nothing to indicate the two ever met. In Sidney Skolsky's September 3rd column, a reader named Esther Buddy writes,
In a recent column you wrote, standing in line waiting to get into the late show for summertime was Leslie Caron with a young man who looked surprisingly like James Dean. That was Norma Jean Nielsen and Jerry Alten, the two kids who did such bang-up jobs on Lux Video the other night in June Bride.
Skolsky responds,
I am willing to accept your word that everyone says Norma Jean looks surprisingly like Karen. But what about Jerry Alten passing for Jimmy Dean? And by the way, who the heat are you, Esther Buddy?
Good question, Sidney. I'm curious as well.
He's got quite a sense of humor, but he's the lowest down creature I've ever met.
After I've gone with him, I'm ashamed to look at myself in the mirror.
Jerry's first public performance as Tom Pittman took place March 25th, 1956, when End as a Man opened at the Players Ring Gallery Theater in Santa Monica.
I was in his room that Saturday night, but if I talk, the disgrace will ruin me.
I'm afraid of the things he makes me do. I know exactly how you beat Georgie unconscious. Got him drunk by sticking that tube down his throat and pouring whiskey in him.
Coincidentally, Jimmy had also starred in an in-house production of Calder Willingham's controversial play during his time with the Actors Studio. According to the bio from the high school Big Shot press kit, Tom landed his supporting role in the production by happenstance when he stopped by the theater to say hi to a friend, only to have the producer hire him on the spot. In my view, anyway, the saccharine whimsy of this version of events seems more in line with something a publicist from the time would have cooked up in the interest of myth building. His online memorial is supported by the events that followed. Tom Pittman made his first television appearance on Science Fiction Theater, produced by Ivan Tors, a month after End as a Man opened.
Willis, you're a good subject. How do you feel?
Great.
Why, just stay in your seat for a moment. Rest. Any questions?
By coincidence or by design, on the very same night of Tom's debut, April 20th, 1956, Frank Alten also made his first TV appearance in a bit part on The Man Called X.
Starring Barry Sullivan. These are the stories of America's intelligence agents.
I've been waiting for you. Do you remember how Van Ryn died some years ago?
In a powerful explosion while conducting an experiment.
One of his own experiments.
You think he caused the explosion?
I have no proof.
Every detail was carefully worked out.
So there would be another explosion?
Of what are you accusing me?
Nothing yet.
Jerry himself would go on to be featured on The Man Called X that November in the episode Underground, playing an Eastern Bloc intelligence agent in a similar vein to the character Frank had portrayed.
Do you know the man who has Colonel Cossack's signet ring and watch? I'd pay well to meet him.
I don't know. Why should a man other than Colonel Cossack have his signet ring?
Colonel Cossack is dead. It hasn't been announced.
That's interesting.
Goodbye.
Jerry's performance in End as a Man led to a stint with the Hollywood Repertory Theater, and he quickly found himself in high demand for television work.
I've got it. I've got it. We'll use my tie and my belt. Okay? Yeah, that's it.
You know, kid, you just thought your way back to life.
Jerry returned to the Players Ring Gallery Theater in March 1957, this time around playing the male lead in Patricia Jowdry's Teach Me How to Cry, a study in the challenges of adolescence. A March 6th review by Willie Williams noted,
Opposite Miss Jean Allison is Tom Pittman, as a lad wise beyond his years.
4 weeks into its run, it was announced that Teach Me How to Cry was in the works to be developed into a movie by Universal. By the time it was released as The Restless Years, by a chance, the same week as Lost, Lonely, and Vicious, the starring roles instead wound up going to John Saxon and Sandra Dee. Whether or not he jockeyed for the movie adaptation of Teach Me Not to Cry, Jerry was already working regularly. By the end of 1956, he'd racked up 9 TV appearances, along with 2 uncredited cameos in World War II sagas. In 1957, he added another 7 TV spots along with 6 feature films to his resume. Thanks to its perennial popularity as the quintessential stylized embodiment of the American myth, the Western genre seamlessly ported to television as it remained a mainstay of feature films. Other than Odors, Jerry continued to pursue tortured youth roles in the James Dean vein, which remained in high demand among casting agents. However, as the fandom refused to die out, Jerry faced an ever-expanding pool of competition clamoring for a tiny piece of the James Dean allure.
What's the matter? Don't you think I do?
Since no complete or expanded interviews with Jerry appear to be available, it's wholly unknown if he had attempted to embrace the method as his acting philosophy, but the linking to James Dean one way or another remains a constant throughout post-mortem accounts.
$9. Boy, I got a hunch this place is a lemon.
Well, it won't be my fault, man. You said it looked good, too.
Yeah, come on.
Leo Gordon wrote the screenplay for the Western noir Black Patch that co-stars Tom alongside George Kennedy. On his Facebook page, Gordon commented,
Pittman was a very dark, moody, eccentric guy with a serious case of the James Deans. He even drove a Porsche Spider, just like his idol.
You're blocking my way.
Notably, Gordon adds,
Dad figured the guy would just grow out of the James Dean thing and go on to have a solid career.
You said that, huh? Yeah, I told him that you was the best I ever saw.
Dad, please, listen to me now. You've always listened to me, haven't you?
No matter what I do, it's not enough. You're killing me.
One theme that had become a cliche in the media as the growing public awareness of adolescence collided with the rise of the James Dean myth was the conflict between the father and the son.
Father-son?
Not only did it harken back to the tragedy of Jimmy's own childhood and his strained relationship with Winton, it appears in one form or another in each of his 3 films. Cal Trask's story arc in East of Eden is centered around his all-consuming, yet futile efforts to earn the approval of his emotionally distant father.
Dad?
This is all going too fast for me,
You better give me something. You better give me something fast.
By contrast, Jim Stark's father in Rebel Without a Cause is attentive and wants the world for his child, but sabotages his responsibilities as a dad through his desire to be a pal. As a consequence, he's left spineless and ineffective.
Dad, stand up for me.
This time, with the son in the position of disappointment and disapproval of the father, the son now becomes empowered to set out on a voyage of self-discovery for himself, as opposed to accepting and abiding by the prescribed rules and restrictions that had been handed down to him. In Giant, Jet Rink starts out as a ranch hand, undefined by any backstory. A man with no family. The owner of the ranch, Bix, played by Rock Hudson, becomes a surrogate father figure for Jet to project an unspoken, displaced parental rage onto. At first, his outward resentment towards Bix is framed as the byproduct of his unrequited infatuation with Bix's new bride, Leslie, played by Elizabeth Taylor. But after a twist of fate makes Jet the owner of a small plot of land that happens to be sitting on a healthy oil deposit, his hostility towards Bix persists, along with an adversarial posture against the world overall.
I don't play it the way he does, Paul. I don't have his flair and...
Just between you and me, Clay, I think your father's a terrible ham. Well, don't you honestly?
Jerry and Frank Alten's television debuts had taken place on the same night, but as Jerry's career picked up, Frank's run as an actor stalled out. Soon enough, he found himself pivoting to a new career as a sports commentator. Specifically, he and his new wife, Pat Hanna, established themselves as experts in auto racing around Southern California. The two co-hosted Motor Classics, a weekly radio program that also aired as a TV special, covering premier events like the Indy 500. According to friends, by 1958, Jerry was making around $60,000 a year, roughly equivalent to $664,000 in 2025. Maybe not enough to start looking at mansions in Malibu yet, but Jerry's first big purchase would end up defining the career of Tom Pittman. A cornerstone of the James Dean comparisons in post-mortem coverage was that both Jimmy and Jerry were driving Porsches when they met their demise. Purposefully or not, the comparison is even rendered more reductive, as Jerry's Porsche is misidentified as a Spider, not only in the press, but by both Sally Kellerman and Leo Gordon. In truth, Jimmy's little bastard was, for all intents and purposes, a stock model straight off the showroom floor when he bought it on impulse. Jerry's Porsche, on the other hand, was more than just an unusual custom job. It was actually a very specific vehicle with a distinct place in Porsche's history, and over the years, a considerable effort appears to have been made to erase Jerry's association with it. And the headline from the 2021 Silodrome article truly punctuates the uniqueness of Jerry's ride. This is the only Glockler Porsche 356 Carrera 1500 Coupe ever built. In the late 40s, Walter Glockler opened one of the first Volkswagen dealerships in West Germany, and in 1950 became the Frankfurt dealer for Porsche. Glockler also had a passion for racing, with a background in motorcycle competition prior to the war. With Volkswagen selling hand over fist, Glockler had the funds to begin developing his own custom builds. In 1948, he collaborated with Porsche's engineering team to make the first of 6, or 7, depending on the source, prototype models, designed for racing and with performance in mind, each building off the successes and lessons from the previous design. Porsche adapted a number of their design elements into their commercial models, including the 550 Spider. In 1954, Walter Glockler completed his final prototype, the 356 Carrera 1500 Coupe. It was the first vehicle to feature a unique vertical engine designed by Ernst Fuhrmann that produced 110 horsepower, a considerable leap from the 70 horsepower a conventional inline motor of the same size could be expected to put out. This configuration would come to be known as the Carrera-style engine. Glockler also chose to add a hardtop, an odd choice at a time when topless models were the standard in racing. But function and performance were kept at the forefront. The windows extended into the roof to make entering and exiting easier while wearing a helmet, and the wraparound rear window offers a panoramic rear view with minimal blind spots while passing. The Glockler Porsche Coupe was designed to compete in the 1954 Mille Miglia, but wasn't finished in time. It did race as number 27 in the Liège-Rome-Liège rally that year, but was disqualified about halfway through after the oil pipe was clipped crossing a railroad track. It sat for a time at the Porsche factory before it was purchased by a Tom Pittman, according to Sotheby's, and exported to the States. Given I was unable to find any record of anyone with the name Tom Pittman in California in the 50s, or anywhere else in the car collector world, it's entirely possible this was a misnomer on Sotheby's part. Adding to this likelihood is the absence altogether of any provenance for this otherwise abundantly documented, historically significant vehicle for decades after it was shipped to LA. Nonetheless, even with only 2 photos available of Jerry's Porsche, it's clear beyond a reasonable doubt that his and the 1954 Glockler Porsche Coupe are one and the same. By 1958, when these photographs were taken, it had been refinished in black and now featured a distinctive pinstriping added to the rear fins and front fenders. The license plate is stamped 1956, suggesting the year it would have been registered by its then current owner.
Remember, it isn't the car that kills, it's the driver.
Up to now, Jerry had a measure of confidence in his abilities, but according to Sally Kellerman, winced at the sight of himself on screen. Whatever Deanian aspirations he was fostering, he felt he had little to set himself apart from the hundreds of other copycats showing up to auditions. Now he was being spotted on the Sunset Strip, driving a flashy, one-of-a-kind sports car with the power to leave any challengers in the dust. Behind the wheel of the Glockler Porsche Coupe, Jerry could finally become Tom Pittman. But about that name, Tom Pittman. How did he come to pick that for his Movieland alter ego? What was the significance? Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Leland Pittman, 1T, began his military career as a pilot in the Army Air Corps before they were reclassified as their own branch and renamed the Air Force. His qualifications as pilot, navigator, bombardier, and radar operator made Pittman one of the force's fabled four-headed monsters, considered to be in the top echelon among airmen. After distinguished service in the Pacific Theater throughout World War II, then Captain Pittman continued to serve as the U.S. entered into the Cold War. On February 12, 1955, he was in a B-47 returning from a training mission when two of the engines exploded in midair over eastern Saskatchewan. Two of the four on board managed to parachute out, while Pittman and the other crewmen were presumed dead. When a search team located the wreckage days later, Pittman was found alive. His leg required amputation, but Pittman had miraculously managed to survive the sub-zero winter climate. On November 1st, 1957, it was announced that Duell, Sloan, and Pierce planned to publish a book about the daring true-life exploits of Captain Pittman. For reasons unknown, author Rutherford Montgomery misspells his last name with two T's in the title, Tom Pittman, USAF. While we have no way of knowing how Jerry came up with his stage name, it's worth noting that the day after this announcement, the currently in production notices for his latest film, The Proud Rebel, make no mention of Tom Pittman, but do include the name Jeff Parrish. Shortly after, Jerry appeared as Jeff Parrish in an episode of Have Gun Will Travel that aired January 11th, 1958. On February 5th, Tom Pittman, USAF, was released. The book turned out to be a heavily embellished pulp novelization aimed at inspiring young males to enlist in the Air Force. At a time when the draft remained a pervasive and broadly unpopular reality for this demographic, this blatant military propaganda failed to make much of a splash. After a couple months of identity crisis, Jerry reversed course and reclaimed the Tom Pittman name for his own. By the release of The Proud Rebel on July 1st, he was billed as Thomas Pittman, though some promotional copy whipped up by the studio ahead of time still make mention of Jeff Parrish.
It's always sad to see.
What?
Little boy trying to grow up too fast.
In August 1958, Tom and photographer Bill Claxton moved into an apartment together at 8520 Sherwood Drive in the Tri-West neighborhood of West Hollywood, a stone's throw away from the beach, the Sunset Strip, Studio City, and the Hollywood Hills. The location couldn't be better for a young actor working steady, and while convention might have been to rent something more glamorous in service of image, Tom Pittman rejected materialism, instead favoring coffeehouses and greasy spoons like Googie's. A quote of unknown origin would later circulate.
I never go any place where you have to wear suits.
The one-bed, one-bath apartment is reported to be 800 square feet, a cozy living arrangement for the two Hollywood bachelors, but it wouldn't be for very long. The last time Bill Claxton saw his roommate was on the evening of Friday, October 31st, 1958. Tom was heading out to a party up in the valley, but Halloween wasn't the only thing his friend Norma Stewart was celebrating that night. 2 days before, the 31-year-old won a divorce after an ugly court battle. Born Norma Jean Aldrich, she'd married her first husband, actor Keith Brazel, in 1943, and the two had a daughter together. Norma and Keith divorced in 1956, and on September 1st, 1957, Norma married again. Husband number 2, 37-year-old architect Michael Stewart, was reportedly jealous and abusive, threatening Norma with physical violence if she said so much as hello to another man. Stewart's possessiveness was reportedly such that he would berate Norma's ex-husband Keith, along with hurling baseless accusations at both in the presence of their 14-year-old daughter. As Tom was leaving Norma's apartment in Sherman Oaks in the early morning hours of November 1st, no one had any concerns. While he may have been moody by default, he appeared to have an upbeat disposition at the party. Everyone who knew Tom knew he was a show-off and an adrenaline junkie with his Glockler Porsche. Bill Claxton later testified,
"He drove fast a good part of the time. He had a sports car and he drove it like one."
And it was well known that Tom especially loved gunning that thing through the tight, winding roads of the canyons that linked Beverly Hills to the San Fernando Valley. In making the trip from Sherman Oaks back to his apartment in Tri-West, Jerry would have most likely been driving east on Mulholland Boulevard, where his decision to turn onto Benedict Canyon Drive would prove to be fatal.
There's danger, 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 danger up ahead. Danger, 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 danger is what it said.
His overconfidence quickly caught up with him as he barreled blind into a hairpin turn on the 2800 block. Unable to correct, Jerry and the Glockler Porsche flew off the west side of the road and 150 feet down a steep embankment. The car landed on its driver's side with Jerry underneath, semi-ejected and pinned between the door and the steering column. The coroner's office later ruled the official cause of death to be a crushed skull and estimated Jerry had died a short time after the accident. Just how long Jerry had suffered, minutes, hours, days even, we will never know. Later that Saturday, after hearing from Bill Claxton that Jerry hadn't made it back from last night's party, Frank Alten called the police to report his disappearance, but was told to wait 48 hours. On Monday, November 3rd, Frank reportedly called to notify them that Jerry had returned. But the next day, Tuesday, he and Claxton filed a missing persons report with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. It is at this point that a shifty character named Robert Bice is said to enter the picture. A bit player who'd been loitering around Hollywood since the early 40s, Bice was now abruptly injecting himself into the investigation. He claimed he'd led the first search effort for Tom, along with actors Hugh O'Brien and Steve McQueen, after the missing persons report was filed. Sally Kellerman was interviewed twice by two men who identified themselves as policemen. One turned out to be Bice. It's unknown altogether if the second man was an officer either, as Sally neglected to verify their credentials. During their first visit, Bice floated his suspicion Tom's disappearance might have been a publicity stunt. At their second meeting, Bice disclosed that he was actually Tom's best friend, which came as news to Sally. Playing good cop this time around, Bice claimed Tom was addicted to heroin and that he and Claxton were lovers. As the bad cop began to grill her on these allegations, Sally acknowledged that he used marijuana, but flatly denied any heroin use or homosexuality. The next day, Friday, November 14th, newspapers first began reporting on the disappearance of Tom Pittman. Speaking to reporters, Frank expressed fears that Tom may have driven off the road somewhere in the canyons. Distraught as he may have been, Frank said far less about his son than the special Porsche he was driving, commenting in depth on plans to have the car refinished and the poor condition of the tires. He also took the opportunity to mention that he is an Austrian count, identifying himself now as Count Frank Xavier Graf Ritter von Gettenbergen, adding that by birthright his son is therefore entitled to the title of nobility as well. The same article cited his mother, but not by name, so it's uncertain if the quote is from biomom Beulah Jodzio or his stepmother, Pat Hanna.
Oh, we're not married. You've got things all mixed up.
Oh, fine. Any way you kids want to handle it. Paula wanted me to drop up and see how you were bearing up.
I'm his mother.
Either way, Tom's mother told the press her son had repeatedly expressed over the last 2 years that he would like to get away. On Tuesday, November 18th, after spotting the broken guardrail, Officer Roy Curtin located the wreckage of the special Porsche at the bottom of the ravine, 17 days after Tom had last been seen. That Thursday, for one day, Tom Pittman was front-page news across the country. Much of the coverage tied in the parallels with James Dean, while qualifying Tom's lost career potential with the callous observation,
"The 25-year-old actor wasn't exactly handsome."
Last rites for Jerry Lee Alten were held at Westwood Memorial Park Cemetery on Tuesday, November 25th. Aside from Sally Kellerman and Frank, Jerry's mom, Mrs. Beulah Adair, was reported to be in attendance. News accounts also make mention of his ex-wife being there, who they identify as Mrs. Pura Brent. While there was a Pura L. Brent living in Santa Monica around that time, no record of a marriage could be located. Delivering the eulogy was producer-director Sam Fuller, who'd worked with Tom on a film he'd shot a year prior that lingered in production hell.
Well, there she is, Mr. Hayden. There's the look hour. Didn't that used to be RKO? That's right, Mr. Hayden.
Filmed in September, October 57, Verboten was the final film shot for RKO Pictures before Desi Arnaz bought them out. The conversion of the once venerable giant of cinema's golden age into Desilu Studios, the pioneers of television production, symbolized the sweeping shift taking place in Hollywood. But with RKO shuttered, Verboten was left shelved indefinitely. On December 12th, news came out that Tom Pittman was a doper. Sally Kellerman states in her book that the police found marijuana in his car as a somewhat foregone conclusion. But it's worth noting that the sole source for this allegation, in every newspaper article I came across, was Robert Bice, now identifying as Tom's ex-agent.
Yeah, well, we'll shove it down their throats.
In the press, Bice claimed to have observed a can of reefer on the dash as the Glockler Porsche was being towed out of the ravine.
That's communism. Communism. That's a good quote. They tried that on me last week, but I told them where to get off.
Beyond this, Bice would only go so far as to say,
I knew from friends, and by the way he acted, that he used marijuana.
Testifying under oath at the coroner's inquest, Bice admitted he'd never seen Tom smoke marijuana himself and identified his primary source as Sally Kellerman.
How do you know? Look at this. Police say the information was phoned in by a girl who identified herself as
Sally Kellerman.
She's a stool pigeon. She squealed. You little fink!
Meanwhile, Mrs. Frank Alten, Pat Hanna, testified that Bice had suggested to her that Tom may have been murdered. Ultimately, the coroner's jury ruled the death to be accidental. By late 1958, Sam Fuller's frustration had reached its breaking point. He'd been trying to get Verboten off the ground since 1950, and after 7 years of false starts and broken promises, he finally had it in the can. Then RKO went under, and now it sat in limbo. And to be sure, Jerry's depiction of Bruno Eckhart, the leader of a pack of underground Third Reich holdouts in post-World War II Germany, is the standout performance of the film. Fuller leveraged the publicity of his death to negotiate a distribution deal. The opening credits even incorrectly list him as introducing Tom Pittman. Actually, Verboten would have been his 7th credited feature film role to date. And while he may have shown enough restraint not to draw parallels in the marketing for Verboten, Fuller was clearly the driving force behind the article The Boy Who Followed James Dean to His Death, published just ahead of the movie's release in March 1959. But even with the tie-in single from Canadian heartthrob Paul Anka, Verboten came and went. However, Tom Pittman still had one last chance to become a household name. His final movie would also be his first and only starring vehicle. Filmed in June 1958, Blood Money was a low-budget noir heist caper with a juvenile delinquency patina. Jerry attempts to force a square peg into a round hole as he short-sightedly tries to Deanify his portrayal of desperately horny school nerd Marv Grant.
Oh, wow, you're just using me.
I'll be right back, Pop. When I get back, maybe we can show them all a thing or two.
But producer Roger Corman was satisfied enough with what he had and lead further into the JD aspect by retitling Blood Money as High School Big Shot when he released it on a double bill with T-Bird Gang in September 1959. As with Verboten, High School Big Shot cycled through the B-movie distribution network to little fanfare, marking the end of the Tom Pittman story.
Pop, forgive me.
But then there was the car. Most articles about the 1954 Glockler Porsche 356 Carrera 1500 Coupe gloss over its time in the States altogether. Some make mention of it turning up at Rudy Klein's famous sports car and luxury salvage yard near Los Angeles. A German buyer exported it back overseas in 1993 and began restoration. It was sold to another collector who was able to restore it to its original specs. And in August 2021, the Glockler Porsche Coupe was put up for auction in Monterey. Sotheby's catalog listing follows their Tom Shipman misnomer with a feigned amnesia over its Hollywood days. They estimated it would fetch between $750,000 and $1 million, but the reserve price was not met and the car remained unsold. A 2011 profile in Classic Porsches magazine goes a little further into the car's Hollywood time.
There, it was purchased by a long-since-forgotten young Hollywood actor. But fate was to deal a cruel hand.
The article frames the accident as if Jerry were a passive participant.
The unique car, with its driver on board, plunged into a canyon after a driver error.
It adds some details about the car's time in salvage.
The wreck finally ended up in the hands of Rudy Klein, a German butcher who emigrated to the States and for decades collected junk cars in Hollywood, which he partly restored and hired out to film companies.
While it's uncertain if the Glockler Porsche Coupe was ever used in any film or TV productions, what is known is that Frank Alten exhibited it for a time in the mid-60s, billing it as Frank Alten's $35,000 Glocker Porsche. At the end of it all, I'm left wondering, did Tom Pittman die trying to become James Dean, or was Jerry Lee Alten trying to send a message to his father?
Remember, the careless driver isn't driving his car. He's aiming it. This is Broderick Crawford saying see you next week.
There are too many faces and too many places to see and nowhere to go.
I cannot be another James Dean? That's absolutely ludicrous. I can be James frickin' Dean. Oh, you want me to prove it to you? Huh, Hillary Duff? White t-shirt. An over jacket of some sort? Oh yeah, of course. The hair, right? Yeah. Water bottle. Do a little of a scruffy hair like this. And the glasses off. And a little squint eyes. And now, for the final touch, a little light source. Jimmy Dean.
Thanks for watching.